Welcome everybody, session 2. Hope you got your coffee, made a break at your favorite exhibitor table. You get to hear my voice for just a minute. This is Agroforestry 101. So if that's not where you want to be, now's the time to slip out. Well, welcome, I'm Jenny. You may have met me already, and I'm going to invite Davida to come on up. I'm going to hand the mic over to her. But just to get things rolling, you all get me to tell you the standard line with all the heart behind it, that we're grateful that you're here, and that we need your session feedback cards from all of these things. I know it's a lot of paper. Believe me, I take them home and put them into the computer. I know how much paper it is. But it is the only way we know what you guys want to see next year. Field days, educational programming, conference. Give us your feedback, tell us what you need, what you liked, what you didn't. We share it with all the speakers. It's really important to us and to making this better for you, for all of us. And I'd like to introduce Davida Flowers.
Hi y'all, my name is Davida Flowers. I am a flower grower down in Oakland, Kentucky. Me and my husband run a farm called Majestic Greens Farm. We're happy to come help out today at Oak. These are our registration cards. Everybody should know that this is the Agroforestry 101 session, and we're happy to have you all here. I'd like to introduce our speakers, which are going to be Darren Bender-Beauregard and his partner Esprit operate Brambleberry Farm outside of Paoli and regenerating the land over the last 18 years. Their main enterprise is a regionally focused plant nursery where they propagate and sell hundreds of species, thank you, and cultivars of edible and useful plants well suited for southern Indiana's heavy acidic soils, hot humid summers, and widely varying winters. They began selling produce direct to consumer and later added pork, sheep, cattle, and geese. They also offer a farm incubator program creating space for aspiring farmers. Darren and Esprit enjoy living in a hand-built straw bale home with their 3 daughters. That sounds very lovely. And also Jody Thompson, an ecologist and horticulturist at Kentucky State University, focusing on ecosystem health and incorporating ecology into agricultural systems. His work predominantly occurs in forest and pollinator habitat and agroecosystems. Currently, his research is examining the effectiveness of different land management systems, studying the feasibility of agroforestry practices like alley cropping and incorporating drones into natural resource management. Jody has held positions in coastal wetland management, forest entomology, ecological design, and sustainable landscaping consulting throughout the southeastern U.S. So without further ado, I'm going to come around and make sure that I pass these out to all of you. If you could all make sure that you get these back to me at the end of the session, that would be awesome. This helps Oak develop their programming, be able to bring you more content, and help get resources to everyone that needs them. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much for that intro. Hey, everybody, how are you? Is the conference been good? Yeah, well, hopefully we won't let you down. We had this plan of, just pretending like we knew what we were talking about, and now we have a crowd. So I think we're stuttering now. So anyway, as Davida had mentioned, I'm Jody Thompson. I'm with Research and Extension with KSU. Ian Thompson up here in the front, distracting me. There we go. Anyway, so we're going to talk to you a little bit about just intro agroforestry content, basically what it is, some very select, just basic info about some select practices, some of the things that we're involved in, and hopefully some of you will be doing some of these practices already, and we really encourage you all to speak up and let us know what you're doing. Because what we found is that agroforestry is not a common thing in this region, and I'm willing to bet that some of you are doing some things that are agroforestry and maybe you just don't know it. So anyway, it's a great system, especially for small-scale landowners, especially those of you who are very interested in integrating different practices. Maybe you're interested in environmental services, but whatever your goals are, we'd love to talk to you about it, and hopefully you'll learn something, and if you don't, hopefully you'll teach us something here today.
I'll just add that you probably saw this afternoon right after lunch, there'll be a second agroforestry session which will go into more of the details of like nuances, what things to consider, that kind of thing. So you won't be getting a whole lot of super deep details in this session. That doesn't mean you can't ask questions, you know, but, and I think Jody and I were saying, raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you, and if you have a question anytime during the presentation, just jump in. We want it to help everybody stay awake and on your toes, so.
Yeah, and two, we're not going to wait through the process, through the presentation to ask you questions periodically. We'd like you to get as much out of it as possible, so we need you to speak up when you have something to say or something to ask. And also, if you could, wait for the mic, because this is being recorded, and for those that might be watching it later, they won't be able to hear you. We'll do our best to repeat the questions, right, and try to get those questions right. But if you could, wait for the mic, and we'll bring them around. All right, y'all ready to get rolling? All right, so Agroforestry 101, basically what is it? It's simply the incorporation of trees or shrubs into some kind of farming operation. Now, which essentially just means any woody plant. Traditionally, it's been trees, right? Because you start trees out in a situation, and when you're waiting for those trees to get larger, you may be wanting to do something else with the land because the trees aren't providing a lot of shade yet. And probably the two most limiting factors to any kind of plant growth is sunlight and water, right? In an agroforestry situation, the issue there is the lack of sunlight. Right? Same thing that weeds do for us most of the time. When they're getting in the way, it's about shade. But you don't have to wait years till you're getting yield off those trees, right? You can have something else going on, maybe intercropped between a couple of things. That's what we call alley cropping. You know, maybe you are interested in fence posts and maybe pine straw. Well, that's probably more relevant to a different part of the country. But use that as an example, it's very common to practice silviculture down in coastal states during like pine tree or pine plantation development because some of those pine stands they're using for things like pine straw and not just timber. Silvopasture is not a great place to be incorporating timber necessarily, but anyway, you have lots of choices. So you're just incorporating woody plants is the point. Is anybody in the room doing anything like this now that you think might be just a sampling? Did you raise your hand? What kind of things?
So our garden, we have fruit trees, elderberries. We kind of developed our windbreaks using woody trees.
And is your intent there to get some kind of yield too out of those windbreaks? Cool. Would somebody over here raise their hand? Yep.
Silvopasture, windbreaks, planting trees like chestnut and fruit trees, yeah, pecan.
I'm going to remember you through the rest of the presentation when we get to that part, especially the silvopasture. Somebody else over here raise their hand? Yeah.
Yeah, silvopasture in logged forests that were logged before we got there, and then also planting alley cropping silvopastures and a little bit of forest gardening.
Yeah, I'm going to remember you too. Going to remember you too. Who else raised their hand? One more.
We're starting to incorporate blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, and hopefully some pawpaws.
Yeah, nice. I will one more. Did you raise your hand?
We have a lot of Russian blackberry that's natural on one side that's been overlogged. On the other side, we have established growth, but not quite old growth yet. All of our blocks, we have cedar windbreak that started on the logged portion that covers over blackberry, raspberry. We have a handful of cherry that started along the pasture on the orchard path. The lower, we've started hazelnuts and mushrooms. On the upper, we have King David apple, Oxford apple, and black old cherry. Thank you.
Thank you for that. One thing I'd like to mention is that KSU's program is growing into agroforestry, and for us that means there's a lot we don't know, is what that means. And so I would really appreciate it, any of you that raised your hand or maybe that are doing things that didn't raise your hand, if you could hunt me down. I'd like to come see what you're doing, right? Because most of my background is, it's a lot of tree health, it's a lot of planting, it's a lot of natural areas management, right? But I'm not the farmer. So I'm usually consulting with producers, and I'd like to learn some things.
Yeah, I was just wondering if collecting sap for syrup is also in agroforestry? Okay.
Yes, so syrup production is agroforestry. It is literally the use of perennial woody plants in any number of combinations. We're just going to focus on select key ones, especially those that have stronger benefits for like environmental services and stuff. Did you have something you knew?
I'm a maple syrup producer, so that's
Okay, cool, thanks. All right, let's move on to the next thing. Darren, you have anything to add as we go?
No, I think I'll jump in after.
Okay, cool. All right, so we've talked about this, what it is. We're going to go through a couple of slides about the benefits, and probably going to lean a little bit more on the environmental benefits than anything else, right? One of the things that I've noticed over my years, I've been in Kentucky 13, maybe 14 years or so working and doing diagnostic work and technical assistance throughout the state. Basically anywhere trees grow, that's where I am. And what I've noticed over the years is it's probably for the past 15 years or so especially, we've seen a stronger contingent of landowners who are equally or nearly equally value environmental services as much as they do production and the economic aspects of their farm. And that's where this really, really plays in really, really well. So anyway, so when you're introducing agroforestry or you're currently doing agroforestry on your farm, a lot of it is about introducing, something that's going to, for economic gain. You're introducing a crop of some sort. And all of you describe things that are agroforestry. So and it seems that most of you are interested in that kind of crop production, but some of you mentioned silvopasture, and that's where we see infrastructure for livestock. Maybe you are wanting to make gains off of your livestock and your trees, but lots of times too, it's simply about the shade. Because if you provide adequate shade to your livestock production, you're usually going to see gains in almost every case, at least that I've been learning about. One of the biggest things though is soil health improvement. Speaker, right? Is soil health improvement, because we're going to probably jump right into how trees help some of that stuff. So this is the first time I put this together, so I might be looking back and forth a little bit. But just some general things that trees do, right? They provide this perennial, long-term root system to your soil. And how do you improve organic matter in your soil naturally? It's usually due to leaves and stems and things like that falling to the ground, but roots also on a tree, they shed their outer sheath. So our skin, for example, is always in a constant state of growth and shedding the dead skin. Roots and tree bark do exactly the same thing. In fact, if you go out and you look at, maybe you've got a tree on your property that's not doing so hot, and it looks like the branches are really rough all over the place, maybe it's lichen growth, but sometimes it's just dead bark that has not shed appropriately because it's not growing appropriately. But when you have that going on in the soil, you have this long-term soil health, you have this long-term soil improvement. Two, those roots provide pathways for water to enter and get deep in the soil. And because we know that most trees, even small trees, have a really big root system, they're benefiting more than just what's right under that tree crown at the same time. Other things they do is improvements for wildlife habitat. Wildlife needs lots of different things. Diverse wildlife need different layers to live in. They need diversity in each of those layers. They need food, they need cover, they need places to reproduce. Certain wildlife, especially the insect world, are endemic to very specific plants, and they really won't live in other places. So anytime you add these perennial woody crops, you're benefiting the entire system, including your bottom line. And that's really one of the big benefits of this. So we'll probably talk about erosion control a little bit more. Well, we'll just talk about it right now, actually. Erosion happens when rain hits soil, bare soil. Erosion happens when water moves across bare soil, right? And over time, it just starts to wear away things more and more and more. So when you have these different layers for rain to hit on the way down, it breaks up the force of that water. And the more stems you have at the ground surface, it breaks up the force of that those shear stresses from that sheet flow of water at the same time. And it doesn't take much to provide these benefits. It only takes a little bit. So there's never too little, is something that you should really consider also. You have anything to add to that?
Got me on. There we go. The only thing I would add is, you know, if your tree plantings get too dense, you may have noticed, like in dense forest or woods, in the wintertime when in our region the trees lose their leaves, you know, they're actually gathering that water as it's coming and channeling it to the trunk. And you can actually, if it's too shady and there's no ground cover hardly, you can still get some erosion in the forest. So to me, that's why I'm a huge fan of silvopasture. I think it's like, I don't know, the cat's pajamas. It does so many things, and I think what I like the most is that it's got trees with really thick pasture between it, that any erosion is going to get stopped by those that mat of vegetation. To me, it's like a melding of two worlds, but I'm kind of biased, so.
I mean, you're exactly right, and that's where those layers come in. A healthy ecosystem is made up of layers. It doesn't matter if it's a forest, it doesn't matter if it's a grassland. If it has multiple, what we call vertical layers, you're heading in the right direction. All right, this is just the Savannah Institute was kind enough to lend us some of their slides. There was no reason for us to sit down and practice our drawing skills or to search for all of the right photos. They've already had some good stuff, and we want to give a shout out to them. They lent us a few of their slides. And Darren in this afternoon's program is going to talk a little bit more about a program they have too. But the whole reason that we have this up here is really just to look at this diagram of the roots. And they're not really illustrating adequately the roots, right? But that's all you can do in this illustration. But the point is that they can be really massive. And two, they're doing a good job of showing different layers because they're showing herbaceous understory, right, in what we call a riparian area. In the riparian area next to a stream or other water bodies, just where during certain events the waters break the banks and they spread out on the landscape. And that place where that water's typically spreading out is called a riparian area. So that riparian area is at risk of a lot of erosive forces, right? And it's also a very unique community into itself. What we often see though in traditional ag systems, or when you have different types of different ownership right next to each other with different goals, more often than not, we see what we call very narrow riparian areas. And I think I'm probably going to show a picture of this here in a minute. And what we're trying to do is encourage folks to, plant as much of that as possible. Let as much of that be trees and shrubs as possible, because you need a lot of space to disperse those forces of water that are moving across the landscape. So. Really, I think this is just the same thing. Yeah, so maybe extra points about, they're also taking up contaminants, and the better your soil is and the more organic matter is in your soil, the more likely some excessive nutrients, pesticides, and other things are more likely to break down in those soils from the microbial communities. Yeah.
Do you have a suggestion on stream edges, a stream that fluctuates vastly in the amount of water capacity it holds, of planting something that's fruiting on the edge of that stream to keep it from eroding, but to still fruit something useful?
Yeah, so the question was, I believe, suggestions about like right at the edge of a stream bank, right, that's pretty dynamic. Can you can you successfully grow something there that will produce fruit? Were you headed somewhere with that first?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for species to plant there, hazelnuts are pretty amazing. They can be underwater for 3 days if it's flooded and still do fine, but they can also take some drought. They have extremely dense, shallow root systems, so it's creating like this fiber mat to hold the banks in place, and then you can get great crops from them for yourself or wildlife. Another one, elderberries grow pretty well up on banks. They can't be flooded as long, or they'll suffer. Yeah. Between the stream and the
Yep.
And then if you're, another one might consider is aronia or black chokeberry, can take some of those conditions. One plant that commonly gets put in these sort of situations, and it just flounders, are pawpaws. There's sort of a myth out there that pawpaws grow down in low swampy areas. They sometimes grow on like river banks up on the riverbank where they don't get flooded and understanding water. They do not like soggy, constantly wet soil. So that's when I would say don't count on that one filling in real thick. And then there's countless species that may not provide uses for humans, but they're excellent at holding the banks, like some of the shorter dogwoods and like silky dogwood and I don't know if red osier grows down here much, but and a lot of these things you can get from the DNR tree nurseries. Every state has one, and it's a program that is there to help people, landowners in that state, buy and plant native species for very, very cheap. It's a subsidized program.
Can the hazelnut establish with cuttings?
No. Hazelnuts are very difficult with cuttings, though if you have established plants, they kind of form like a thicket of stems, and you can take a shovel and divide them and divide them and then divide them. So if you're wanting clonal plants that are like a really high producing type and you want to like reproduce that, you can plant one in kind of a nursery bed area or somewhere and then later come through, dig divisions off. But a lot of hazelnuts, a lot of them will be growing from seed, and especially on like a long riparian buffer, and you have a lot of chance to put seedlings out, and then you can watch for the individuals that are the best producers, the best quality nuts, and then you can divide off of those and move those elsewhere. But
I just want to echo what Darren said, and also say I wasn't aware of that about hazelnuts. I don't have a lot of experience with hazelnuts myself, except in higher, drier locations. Now, from a restoration habitat management standpoint, the position that you've described is very difficult. I think a lot of us working in the business, those of us that used to work in the business, we've all had tree plantings get blown out by a flood. So one of the typical things that we do is we practice something called live staking. And it's not appropriate for everywhere, but something like elderberries are one of our best natives that respond to live staking, and that just means you're taking stem cuttings from the ends of the branches of things. In stream restoration, it is elderberries, non-bark, all kinds of willows, sometimes sycamore and things like that. They root really easily, and so because you're shoving those stakes, those 1 to 4 foot stakes, preferably 2 to 4 foot, almost all the way into the ground, you have a lot of area for root growth, but then you have this shove it all the way in the ground, or take something that's at least half an inch up to like an inch-ish, and like a dead blow or a nylon hammer, and that's what we do. You get thousands or hundreds of live stakes, and you're just walking around shoving and hammering, shoving and hammering. Elderberry responds really well to that. Right? Not necessarily hazelnut, but that's a difficult situation, and probably right next to a stream. I often do advise folks not to put something that you're dependent on economically too close, right? But if it's simply habitat enhancement and you're wanting some flowering things there especially, there are lots of options. Willows and buttonbush is the best. I gave a tree installation talk here a couple of weeks ago, and I told a story about I had this live staking project, and I had a bucket of buttonbush stakes that I had left in my backyard for like a year, and just like, I need to do something with that, just get rid of it, right? My wife didn't want a bucket just sitting in the backyard. And so I have a wet spot, and I'm just, there was like 9 left. I shoved them all on the ground, 7 of them lived. The rest of the species wouldn't do that. But that one in particular is a native stream bank wetland species, and it is almost perfect. Probably the best would be willow, really. So in the back, let me bring you the mic.
I wanted to add real quick to that, just that even though some things like buttonbush may not have anything that we can eat as humans, buttonbush is an excellent bee. A lot of beekeepers plant it for pollen and nectar when there's kind of a dearth in the summer.
Yep, question in the back?
Well, not so much a question, but with the live stakes on a stream bank, if your priority is stabilizing the stream bank, the stakes can be put in vertically and horizontally, which gets you a real net of roots under the soil to hold things. And the willows and poplars are fast to do that, and whatever it was that you were planting apparently will respond very quickly. But that vertical and horizontal really knits the bank together.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hill. And she could give this entire talk by herself, by the way. So, yes.
Talking about the live staking, I've been doing stream restoration for 40 years and using willow and predominantly for DOT projects where we've had a big blowout on bridge embankments and things like that. And of course you want to take your cuttings in the dormant time of year, which is right now, and you can bag them and hold them in a cool place for several months, and they'll be fine. In fact, when you open those bags, they'll have little sprouted roots all over them. And but I was going to say, for some of these projects, the sandbar willow is great if you really want to colonize your banks completely to hold them, but you don't want to do sandbar willow unless you need areas taken over totally. Whereas your black willow is the best willow variety native for doing the staking and just having a singular tree stump with multiple trunks coming out of it. And there's such a great early pollen source for your bees and your pollinator species. And you can also, then you can coppice them and then use that wood for hugelkultur or small building projects or trellises. That's what we do at our farm. And we're on the Kentucky River, and we have a lot of steep areas but with good soil. And so we stake a lot of the areas where the water is, the watershed takes it into a narrow pinch point. And so we stake that heavily. And in a stream situation, you don't want to have your stakes against the force of the water. You need to have them so that the water can move past them and not rip them out before they're able to root.
Thank you for that. I have been toying with this idea of doing just a live staking stream bank workshop through KSU, and that's probably something we're going to be doing here in the near future. So if that is an interest to y'all, make sure you keep in contact with us.
One other species that I think is not used much and there's going to be a lot of demand for is the native river cane, like the native bamboo. And that makes, bamboos just of all types make such a shallow woven mat. And that's something you may have to plant up on the bank a little more, and it might creep towards the river as it can and hold it. But that's kind of a neat species if you look into that and how it was used. And there's not a whole lot of it around, doesn't seem like.
Thanks. Okay, so now we're going to move into just some select practices. We don't necessarily expect to get through all of these, but I think this whole thing will be available to you, though, at some point. So these are kind of like the top ones, right? Especially where you're combining different crops and different goals together. That's part of the reason. Also, they're just your more common ones. So we're just going to move right into this. Once again, thanks to Savannah Institute. So alley cropping is you just have usually widely spaced rows of whatever your woody plant is, and you've got something intercropped in between. It can be as simple as just 2 rows of trees with some grains or some veggies or soybeans or something, some kind of forage planted in there. It could also be rows of shrubs intercropped with, just conventional annual row crops, your veggie crops. It could be trees intercropped with small shrubs. And historically, this practice was developed, once again, you have a long-term crop goal in mind, like something with that tree, and then in the meantime, before it develops its shade, to shade other things out, you can be using the land for other things. In some cases, though, especially if you're using trees and you're considering things like 50 to 60 foot between row spacing, you can have permanent long-term alley cropping, right? So it's great to have all these different combinations of things. We are working with a farmer partner in Hodgenville, and last year he installed a 5-acre elderberry alley cropping system. It's short rows, and in between his rows, in one section, he has native seed crops. So native herbaceous seeds that he's going to be harvesting and selling to seed. He's a partner with Roundstone Native Seed, for example, if you are familiar with them. And in another section of this plot, it's cutflowers. So, and he's going to keep parts of that going long term, and he expects, though, that these elderberries are going to create enough shade at some point that he's not going to keep all these rows, right? So we're examining that for like feasibility and what works with different crops. But the combinations are endless is the point, right? And so kind of think about that. It's great for all kinds of things, all kinds of combinations. It's probably a more versatile system than many of our other agroforestry systems. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say the really important thing, if you start looking into alley cropping, you'll find pretty quickly that if you want good production from your whole alleys, the space in between your tree rows, and it doesn't happen as much when the trees are very small, but there's a lot of root competition that the trees, especially if they're shallow rooted species of trees or shrubs, that will come out into the crop area. And so a practice that people have figured out that has been working is to take a subsoiler or chisel plow and annually do a root pruning run, where you're going to run that ripper, on either side of these tree rows, not right against the trees, but just kind of the interface. And what it does, it continually kind of prunes off new roots, small roots that are forming from those trees, and keeps them kind of keeps them in the row underground, so to speak. And if you don't do that, you'll have like a gradient. When you grow like a crop of corn here, it'll be like a little gradient going up, down the corn. It'll be nice and tall in the middle, and kind of it's getting nutrients kind of pulled out at the edges. So, and then the other thing to, I think I lost something else about alley cropping, but you can hear more details of some of those nuances in this second session. But I think we had a question right over there.
Is there a better orientation for alleys? Northwest, east, or north, south, east, west, or on contour?
Mm-hmm. So we'll get more into that in the second session, but the short answer is for alley cropping, east-west is best. It's just shown the way the sun patterns go and the season that the crops are growing. The alleys get more total sun hours than if you do north-south plantings.
North-south, you're going to see a lot more shade competition in this section of your intercrop species, your intercrop crop.
But then as we get into silvopasture, though, I have my silvopasture planted north-south because it's way better for the animals. If you're after shade for your animals, north-south is better because you get moving shade patches throughout the day. It moves your animals across your pasture, and it also gives them more shade, whereas east-west, there's going to be times of the year where there's no shade for them in certain paddocks. So and contour is a whole bag of worms. If anybody's, there's a lot of debate on like swales and doing that. We'll get into that in the second session too. But planning on contour is great for erosion. And if you're willing to, the main thing is whether you're willing to work with your equipment or fencing within lots of curvy rows. So it's just a reality you'll be living with for the rest of that life system of the life of that system.
Yeah, and I think we've covered most of these, just some general points about it. Another thing we probably didn't say is in narrow spacing, smaller, crop systems like shrubs. Sometimes it can be hard to get harvesting equipment into those situations too. So a lot of, especially very small scale situations like elderberries, we're growing into elderberry production here, and we recognize there's not a great, really it's going to be by hand, especially in nearly all cases where your system is very small and tight. Anything to add to that?
No, I think the thing I was saying earlier about alley cropping is it's kind of neat to think from a really large scale perspective. There's large scale grain farmers throughout, U.S. There would not need to be a whole lot of changes to their tools, tractors, equipment that they use to install a row of chestnuts or hazelnuts, in these huge crop fields. And if you think of overall what that would do for the ecology, for wind erosion, for just, keeping some, in droughts, blasted sun off the fields a little bit, and providing habitat for livestock in these vast, thousands of acres of just one crop. It just seems like something that if we could convince larger scale farmers to just put some long rows in, even if it's not going to be a huge profitable crop, what that would do to the large scale ecology of our landscape in North America, that'd be pretty amazing.
So I realize, sorry.
You can just scream.
I realize, we're at oak right now, and most people aren't going to do this, but conventional grain farmers are obviously using a lot of herbicide. How resistant are these trees to Roundup and other common herbicides? That would be my first concern.
Yeah, it's a great question. And certain species like hazelnuts are extremely resistant to herbicide drift. So there are certain species that if you're in a little postage stamp sized organic farm in a sea of conventional ag, there are species you can plant on the perimeter that will handle the herbicide drift. Chestnuts are extremely sensitive. So that is a consideration, and it may be something where you'd have to really watch your spray patterns and make sure when you do apply herbicide, it's going to be on a really low wind day, and keep it a certain distance away. Now, dilute rates, and we'll see when we go out and see the pawpaw planting in the second session. Diluted herbicide is used commonly as a ground cover management practice for all sorts of trees, orchards to even timber plantings. So because the roots are deeper, like the soluble, like liquid applied herbicide, trees are going to be more resistant to that than annual plants will be. Not that I'm recommending you do that, but just it is a reality, like you said. So it's a huge consideration.
I'm going to make a point real quick. A big thing about herbicide use is the right herbicide for the job, the right time of year. Lots of herbicides are susceptible to volatilization, so they're turning into a vapor form, and then they're spreading, right? Glyphosate will do it. Different formulations of triclopyr, you may know as Garlon, will do it. There are certain herbicides that are what we call soil active, and if it contacts roots of other plants, it could stress them or kill them. But we also, when done well, it can be a valuable, caveat that, when done well, it can be a valuable practice in certain situations. And if you are managing the right herbicide for the right situation, in some cases it's more, let me just step back. Shorter plants are easier to kill than bigger plants because they're easier to accidentally treat. During the early part of your establishment of your stands or whatever you're calling them, right? Your production plots and stuff like that. If you're doing foliar application, which is what we're doing most of the time, we're targeting the leaves. All that foliage is very close to the ground where you're spraying. That's a really, really risky time to be doing that. If you're using trees specifically, it's hard to kill a tree with glyphosate just by spraying the bark. That is a fact. If you're using oil-soluble herbicides, it's really easy to kill a tree by spraying the bark. And there's all kinds of situations that I'm not describing here. But just know that there is a right time and a right place, and there is definitely a wrong time and a wrong place for it. So if you're not very experienced with herbicide use and it's something you're going to do, you really do need to be talking to folks that have a lot of experience with it, especially if this is something that you're growing for wildlife benefits or as, that you're economically dependent on. Yes, ma'am.
Can American hazelnuts or European hazelnuts when you're speaking of hazelnuts?
The ones that can stand the deep water flooding would be the American or hybrid hazelnuts, and it's a good distinguishing factor. The native hazelnuts stay pretty short and they sucker out and spread and make thickets. The European hazel are often grown as trees out west. They don't like to grow as trees, but they get to be a lot taller and they do not sucker out very much on the sides. So But the American hazel and the hybrid hazel, which is a cross between those two, are the ones that can handle flooding for up to 3 days. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend putting the pure European hazels right on riverbanks. Good catch there.
So this is just an example. Just wanted to see, an actual example of alley cropping. And once again, this doesn't show all the potential things that you could be doing with it. But these are young walnut trees, around what looks like it might be corn. So, but that's typical situation. There will be a point, right, where those walnuts will shade that corn too much. So I'm going to guess that this is not going to be a species they're intercropping for the long term, right? It's kind of like a snapshot in time. Now, another thing they might be doing at some point is they may be thinning alternate rows. So they may either be thinning within the row to allow extra sunlight in, or they may be taking out an entire row. Chances are these are going to be grown for a nut crop. Just because of the way they're grown here. People grow walnuts for all kinds of reasons. But anyway, that's an example. So.
And one other thing that some people are doing, if you're really focused on the long-term health of your woody crop, that's going to be a long-term harvest, so to speak, you can focus heavily on cover cropping. Instead of growing the annuals to harvest for grain or products that you'll sell, you can instead just take that time, if you have that flexibility, to just do like intensive cover cropping and build as much soil while you have sun in between the tree rows. And that's a great strategy. It's just, then you're getting like no income from that acreage but then you'll probably have much better long-term production and lower inputs later on.
Yeah, one of the next most common types of agroforestry that folks are interested in, even if they're not practicing it, is silvopasture. And once again, that's integrating livestock into some kind of usually tree system. It can be small tree or shrub system if you're looking at things like poultry, for example. But there are lots of combinations for this too. Couple of pictures. I'm not sure what these trees are, right? But this is, if I were to guess, if that was in the eastern U.S., that's probably a southeastern orchard of some sort, and they've got some kind of forage grown underneath. We see pines, right, and cattle. We see chickens over here. I'm not sure what that is. It kind of looks like cottonwood to me, and they may be growing these, for example, as a biomass crop or something like that. So, but lots of different combinations. This I really have less experience with, other than diagnosing sick tree issues where cattle are running into the woods. If you're growing for timber, if you really need trees that are not undergoing stress, that are not getting a lot of root damage and stress, you should consider whether large livestock at least is going to work for you. And now small ruminants, something like goats, we know goats strip bark. We know goats will climb a little bit, right? They're not tending to do a lot of damage after these things get, the crown of the trees get several feet tall. Shrubs would probably be an ultimately bad option with goats. But you've got all these combinations of things, and I will just say you really need to think about what the tree or shrub crop that you're integrating with your livestock is, because they're not all equally susceptible. If timber is an option for you, you probably don't want to be running cows through it in most situations. They do it in pines a little bit more because pines grow vigorously, they have shorter rotations, and those crowns of those trees will get up taller. You may see lower crowns in hardwoods for a longer period of time. What's your experience on this?
So again, silvopasture is one of my favorite things. The other interesting thing about silvopasture is they've done studies in the Northeast, and there's actually higher dry matter production of pasture with a certain percentage of shade from trees. So when you do silvopasture right, you can actually increase your pasture productivity. Now that's mostly cool season grasses. I don't think that probably applies to like warm season, prairie type grasses, but you see a definite, well-studied is effective shade on livestock. Everybody knows that's a huge benefit in the summer, especially in our more southern regions. But there is a benefit to the pasture, and that does have to do with the shade and the buffering that does in the hottest weather. And then the one other thing I wanted to say is just be very careful selecting your species of trees, because like Jody said, your oaks are probably never going to be super happy with like heavy cattle around them in a silvopasture, but honey locusts are excellent, and they're going to provide, if anybody you know about honey locusts, they have a potential for amazing forage from the pods that drop that can be, for small ruminants, equivalent to barley in the nutrition, in the protein and carbohydrates. Persimmons, I think, it's kind of my like pet project, is persimmons, especially for feeding hogs. They drop in the fall, and you can fatten hogs on persimmons. It's like they're eating bags of candy. And persimmons are one of the best adapted species, extremely versatile in all different types of soils, can just kind of keep popping back and take a lot of abuse. So just think about the species, and especially also how the root of that tree species behaves, because if it's very shallow rooted, it's going to spread out and it will compete for nutrients with the pasture as well. So,
and rotation is in almost 100% of cases going to be necessary. You don't want to keep anything for too long in any of these stands, walking over any of these roots, potentially doing other types of damage. Greg, do you have any particular experience with silvopasture stuff? Yeah.
Just getting into it. This is really, so I'm primarily cattle producer, farmer. So right now it's just literally on the last farm that I purchased, there are a lot of walnuts and a lot of locusts, saplings that came up, and I'm basically just protecting those the best I can. My next step, actually, persimmons and apple trees this year are my next step, so I want to talk to both of you.
How are you protecting those from cattle?
And Greg Brand probably has a lot of experience here, but the locust, it's better if you do protect them. And so to answer your question, and I'm trying to remember the name of these, and I don't think they make them anymore, but it basically is a mesh wire that has really sharp barbs on it. Arbor shield. They're better for something like sheep. They're not tall enough for cattle, so I've got to kind of keep moving them up and I don't like them. I'm actually developing a system with electric wire, and I'm experimenting with it. So I'm not even going to. It's really where you're going to have to connect trees with electric wire, and basically put a mesh around them, put them on rods or insulated. So I had a feeling that you're probably trying something like this, and that's why I want to talk to you later. But I'm just experimenting. I'm not going to recommend it. I'm really in the experimental stage. Ask me in 2 or 3 years. But I think that's going to work a lot better in the arbor guards for cattle. There's just too many. You agree with that limitation?
There's a guy, treesforgrazers.com, I think. It's Austin Unruh. He's in Pennsylvania. He has been he does a lot of silvopasture consulting and installs. But he has found a really interesting system that is working where using the tree tubes, the plastic tree tubes, which we'll get into a little bit this afternoon more, are a great way to protect trees from livestock and deer browsing. They're also plastic, and you also usually have a fiberglass stake with them. And you can actually hook electric fence right up and use those tubes as an insulator. And it's working great for them. And then you already have your posts there, and if your trees are set up in a way, it's like, it's been working really well with him. So
we have a question in the back.
Yeah, after the energy set next door last hour, talking to one of the speakers, and one of the other people asked a question. He was talking about solar panels 10 feet tall running sheep under it, and it seems to me silviculture is being replaced there with solar culture, and there's shade and running sheep, and I would think that the solar panels, although they don't have roots, they stands for them would help to reduce erosion to some too. So that might be something to consider.
Yeah, the whole solar thing is a growing, and in regard to on-farm solar or solar in like natural resource situations, they're still trying to figure a lot of things out. Traditionally it's been these panels have been relatively low. They do provide a lot of shade. They can be difficult to manage around. So, how do we introduce pollinator habitat and sheep to this? If you put goats out around solar panels and your solar panels are too low, your goats are going to be on top of your solar panels. We see that, right? Yes, ma'am.
I just saw an article the other day about they're starting to look at vertical solar panels so that they're double-sided so they get as much sun as possible, but they're vertical instead of horizontal.
Nice, thank you for that. All right. Yeah. So, I think we've kind of pretty much covered this. It is really crop dependent, it's goal dependent, rotation is necessary, and there's as many caveats to it as anything, but as Darren said and others have mentioned, there's a high value for that shade. Those of you that do goats, for example, you know that you can't just set them out in the middle of the field for weeks at a time in the middle of summer and expect them to be productive, expect that to be good for the goats. Same thing works with large ruminants like cattle, but there's a high value in it, and I think it's growing, and we'd really like to see what folks are doing in Kentucky and be a part of that conversation. So.
One other thing, just again, from that large, like I talked about the larger farm fields, what I also like about silvopasture is it's a mimic of savanna habitat, which was a lot more prevalent in kind of the Midwest region, and I love the idea of this from a larger landscape perspective with silvopastures bringing savanna back, essentially. So.
All right, so riparian buffers, really that just means your ultimate goal is to protect the water. Because the big thing that happens is you have surface waters running across the crop field, running across another type of landscape of some sort, roads nearby, you've got all that storm water runoff, and all that stuff's going into the stream. It could be oils from your cars. A lot of what it is, though, is sediment, right? Silt and stuff like that getting into the water that affects the lower substrate of the stream. It affects the actual action of the stream. How that riparian area works doesn't just affect that place. There's a saying that whatever's going on upstream is really what's affecting you downstream. So it's a big system, and one landowner affects another landowner. It's a constant thing. At one point in my life, I was doing freshwater mussel surveys, and yes, you had to do surveys in these streams, cows crapping in the water next to you, all these erosion issues going on next to you, fertilizers and algae blooms that were an effect of nutrient runoff, and at the same time you see these dynamic, rapidly occurring changes to the substrate, right? And stuff that goes on in the bottom of that stream affects the entire water column. And it affects things downstream too. It's not just a species for species sake issue. Let's say that you're a fisher person, you like to go fishing, right? All this stuff affects that. The water that we drink here in Frankfort comes out of the Kentucky River. Kentucky River is fed by other creeks, and all that stuff's impacted by lands surrounding all these things. So the wider these riparian buffers are, the better, because less of that stuff gets in the water. But you can take advantage of these situations and you can protect them while also improving wildlife habitat and maybe getting a little economic benefit out of it. You're more likely, though, to be successful in your cropping just outside of the edge of that regular flood zone. That's what's going to be safe for you as far as producers. But there's lots of options for things to do between that area and the stream itself. And that's a long conversation in itself that I'm glad to have with any of you. And it sounds like there's a couple other folks in the room who's got some experience with that as well. So anything to add?
And I'll just add, with all these practices, especially riparian buffers, there is a lot of funding through NRCS, SWCD. There are nonprofits that have funding. And for general agroforestry, there's a lot of programs starting, and we'll talk more about it at this afternoon session, with loans that take into account the long-term crop potential for these. That it's kind of hard to get loans for most agriculture is suited for very short yields. So just know there's more and more funding.
Oh, y'all, we have a little bit of time left. I'm gonna come around and start collecting those cards. Thank y'all.
So our next practice is windbreaks, and a windbreak, it's kind of an intuitive description. It gets in the way of wind. It breaks up those forces. Sometimes it's erosion related. Lots of time though, it's crop health related. You know, if you have high winds and frequent winds, especially in this region of the country, right? The greater the force of wind over a leaf surface, the easier it's going to dry that plant out. So it requires more maintenance and care. That's true for the entire plant world, period. Anything that has leaves on it. There are structures in those leaves that are there to take in and release gases, but also to release water. So you have to account for that. And different crops and different plants are more susceptible than others to these. And at the same time, it can be noise barriers. Noise barriers work, but they have to be well designed, right? Now, to get your most benefit out of something like this, you're usually going to want a layered approach, not just one row of trees. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that, right? If that's all you have to work with. But to get the maximum effect, remember those layers we talked about in wildlife habitat? Think of this too, right? Multiple layers of trees, offset, especially if you have a combination of evergreens and deciduous trees. But at some point in the setup, this is a great place for fruiting trees and shrubs for all kinds of reasons, right? Because it's really, in this case, it's more about soil conditions than anything. They're going to be great for those plants, but you use them to your advantage for windbreaks, or if you're my neighbor, you may not want to see into my backyard or something like that, right? What do you have to add?
The only thing I want to add is just if you look at any windbreak studies or diagrams, just know that they protect farther out from where their edge is. Like if you want this area here to be wind protected by the windbreak, these will do that. They start protecting about that point. They don't necessarily protect right behind them. It's the way the wind sort of spirals up and over the windbreak. It has kind of like a turbulence on the backside. So you want to put your windbreak, locate it. It depends on how high your windbreak's going to be, how far out you locate it from where you're protecting. And that might be your house too. I mean, windbreaks have a huge benefit for protecting and lowering your heating and cooling costs. So, but.
And this session time is about over with. We're probably going to hang out just for a little bit. If y'all want to talk a little bit more, we'll need to make sure somebody's not using the room immediately after. But on the wildlife angle of things, right, we have so much cropland adjacent to so many poor condition woodlots and forested areas that these are really, really important wildlife corridors. And when I say wildlife, I don't just mean deer. I mean all types of vertebrate and invertebrate. Those are all wildlife. And these are really, really important structures, features for lots of different wildlife species too. So, and we can probably, hopefully some of y'all attended the forest farming talk on Thursday. That was great. I learned a lot. Some of the indicators they went over, some of the indicators I use for certain types of ecological understory development. They're very, very similar, especially when you're dealing with native plants. But if y'all want to continue this conversation, this is probably the one I have the least amount of experience with. Darren, I don't know if you have experience with this.
I just have. We've grown different mushrooms on logs, but we haven't grown ginseng or yellow root. But this is if you have a very wooded property and you're like, what can I do with this besides cutting all these beautiful trees down? Forest farming is very worth looking into, and there's a lot of interesting things going on with it. So,
and that includes your maple syrup production. So, we're going to wrap this up here. I believe, if you need our contact info, that's mine and Darren's contact info. We're also going to be, Darren's going to be leading the workshop this afternoon where we're talking about incorporating woody plants into your operations. And we're going to be talking about things like spacing and general plant health and weed management. So if you want to attend that or just continue any of this conversation, we can do that.
And I want to plug again SavannahInstitute.org that was up there as a credit to the slides. I can't say enough good things about that organization. It's growing. Unfortunately for us, it's based more in like north central Illinois and Wisconsin. That's where their hub is at. But us and a few other farms in Indiana, southern Indiana, are working with them. And just go to their site. They have tons of free stuff. So